At the time of recording this, most guitar players are mourning the loss of the late great Jeff Beck. However, another player that passed away, who some of you might not be aware of, is a great session jazz guitar player called Dennis Budimir. Although Budimir was not a household name, you'll have definitely heard his guitar playing because, along with Tommy Tedesco and Bob Bain, he was part of the legendary Wrecking Crew. Budimir's recording career spanned over 4 decades, and during that time he actually played on over 900 films and TV shows. As impressive as those credentials are, most of us jazz guitar enthusiasts will be interested in Budimir's work as a jazz artist. So he began recording and playing with people like Chico Hamilton, Eric Dolphy when he was in New York, and then he moved to LA, the West Coast, where he pursued his work as a session artist, a session guitar player, and he began recording and playing with some of the jazz cats who were on the West Coast at the time. Some of the jazz artists that Budimir worked with included Peggy Lee, Eric Dolphy, Bud Shank, Gary Peacock, Ella Fitzgerald, Milt Jackson, Jimmy Smith, and plenty of others. Some of those were standalone kind of jazz records, and some of them were a little bit more commercial, where he was just basically playing rhythm guitar or something like that. Like I've previously mentioned, Budimir played guitar in Chico Hamilton's band, and Chico, kind of like Red Norvo, always had the top and best guitar players in his band at the time. So the other guitar players, or at least some of them that played in Chico Hamilton's band, were guys like John Pisano, Jim Hall, Howard Roberts, those kind of players. So he was one of the cats that played with Chico Hamilton when he was around New York. He was actually in Chico Hamilton's band the same time as Eric Dolphy, who's the late great saxophone player who unfortunately passed away at quite a young age. But while Budimir was in New York, he actually shared his accommodation with Eric Dolphy, and it's interesting, it's just a philosophy. If you check out some interviews, guys asking Budimir about who he likes and who's influenced him, then I think that sometimes he mentions some of his contemporaries. So he's mentioned Eric Dolphy as being someone that he greatly admires, and some of his other contemporaries around that time. Maybe some of the guys were a little bit older, like Jimmy Rainey, who was a little bit older, and he also liked Billy Bean's playing. He got to meet Billy Bean when he was on the West Coast there. I think he actually replaced Billy Bean in Bud Shank's band around that time, late 50s, early 60s. But yeah, if you listen to some of those records, which I'll get onto in a minute, you will definitely hear that, in my opinion, guys like Eric Dolphy kind of influenced his style a little bit. There's a little bit of kind of abstractness and freeness in his playing, in his style. So before I checked out Dennis Budimir, I thought maybe Jim Hall was kind of the first jazz guitar player to play like that, maybe in the 60s, definitely in the 70s. He kind of really made that style popular. But if you listen to some of these records, which I'll share with you in a minute, then you can definitely hear that Budimir is an early pioneer of that. I've only mentioned guitar players so far, but there's an interview of Dennis Budimir here on YouTube, and he says that his two biggest guitar influences were actually Charlie Parker and Bud Powell, and you can definitely hear that in his playing as well. He was kind of great at playing open and abstract, but he was very technically proficient. You can hear him play some beautiful, fast bebop runs on some of these records. In terms of his guitars, obviously Budimir owned several different session guitars, quite a lot of models by Valley Arts, but for his jazz work he was a big fan of Charlie Christian pickups, which he got introduced to when he went to Jimmy Rainey's house when he lived in New York and played Jimmy Rainey's ES 150, which is the Charlie Christian guitar. That's the one with the big Charlie Christian pickup. And since he started playing Jimmy Rainey's guitar, he then went on to get an ES 150 of his own, a 1938 ES 150. And later on he picked up a 175, which had a Charlie Christian pickup in. They only made that for 1 year in 1979. And at one point he actually owned 3 ES 15s with Charlie Christian pickups in. If you've never heard Dennis Budimir's playing before, then where should you start? Well, the easiest ones to find are the ones in which he played on as a sideman. I'm a big fan of Fresh Sound Records, and there's a couple of albums by him which I really recommend checking out. You can buy the physical CDs if you're old school like me, but they're also available on a few different streaming platforms. The first album that you need to check out is called The Complete Studio Sessions by Chico Hamilton. This is when Eric Dolphy was also in the band, and this is a really nice 2-disc compilation of the recordings that Dennis Budimir made with Chico Hamilton in the late 1950s. The next record that you can check out is called New Groove, and that's by Bud Shank. As I previously mentioned, Dennis Budimir replaced Billy Bean in Bud Shank's band, and this is the album that they made together, and that features some great guitar playing by Dennis Budimir on that as well. The last record on which Budimir appears as a sideman is a record by John Pisano and Billy Bean called the West Coast Sessions. As I mentioned, he was around the West Coast at the same time as both of those guys, and I think he appears on one track on that CD, which is well worth checking out. That wraps up some of his work as a sideman and a guest artist, but if you've got a record player and you want to seek out some of his own releases, then Budimir actually did a few releases on a record company called Revelation. So the first one is called Sprung Free, and this is the actual record which I'm very fortunate to have on loan at the minute. I'm writing a piece about him for the Huddersfield Jazz Guitar Society, and a friend of mine has kindly lent me his records to research Dennis Budimir. So that's the first one. It's called Sprung Free, one of his first albums as a leader. The next album as a leader that you want to check out is called Alone Together, and this is a duo record, and it's quite interesting, this one. And if you like things that are a little bit more abstract and kind of free and open, then this is a great record. When I initially kind of heard it and checked it out, I wasn't a massive fan, but I've come to appreciate and like this one more now that I understand a little bit more about Dennis Budimir and his style and what he was going for. Another Revelation release that you want to check out by Dennis Budimir is called A Second Coming there, and you can see on the photograph that he's actually playing a 12-string guitar, which is not featured on the record, thankfully. Sorry for those of you that may like 12 strings in jazz, but I always find that they sound better on 70s rock records rather than jazz guitar settings. This is probably from one of his sessions when he was a session guy. I imagine that's when that photograph's from, but this is a really nice quartet record that is certainly worth seeking out if you can find it. The last one is called A Session with Albert, which is referring to Albert Stinson. Definitely worth seeking out if you can find this one. So that is called A Session with Albert Volume 1, which is also released on Revelation. I'd like to just take a minute and thank a few people that have assisted me in the research of Dennis Budimir. The first is Jim Carlton, who published an excellent interview with Dennis Budimir in Vintage Guitar magazine. I think it's the November 2012 issue, and that really helped me out in researching a lot about Dennis Budimir for this video. I'd also like to thank Adrian Ingram for initially telling me about Dennis Budimir and helping me out in the research for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any comments or thoughts about Dennis Budimir's playing, then please share them in the comment section below. Thank you for watching.